Greetings and welcome to everyone who is here today. My name is Dr. Julio Friedman. I am a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and director of the Carbon Management Research Initiative here. Today, we are going to discuss the dynamic landscape of CO2 recycling in the context of a circular carbon economy. We will take a look at different technologies, their energy and infrastructure needs, and their ability to reduce and remove greenhouse gases. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. This event shares the findings of a report that is part of a collaboration on the circular carbon economy between the Center on Global Energy Policy and the Global CCS Institute. We're delighted to have their representation and participation here today. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the exceptional set of participants and speakers we have here today. I will start that actually by introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy. She, before that, and I guess still is, Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and prior to that at Worcester Polytech. She's also a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, where before she joined the administration, she led WRI's carbon removal program. I have had the good fortune of knowing Jennifer for many, many years. She is simply one of the world's foremost experts on carbon capture, carbon use and recycling, and carbon removal. We couldn't be happier and more pleased to have her join us here today. With that, I offer you her comments. Take it away, Dr. Wilcox.
Thank you so much, Julio. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Columbia University and the Center on Global Energy Policy for inviting me to take part in this discussion today. And I want to focus my opening remarks on what we're doing in the Department of Energy, and more specifically in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, to advance the Biden-Harris administration's mission to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And to get on track to meet this goal, we also have the nearer term goals of 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, less than a decade away, and 100% clean electricity by 2035. Carbon capture and storage will be a significant component among the portfolio. In the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, we plan to continue our investments on CCS in the power sector, but will expand toward industrial decarbonization as well. Achieving net zero goals, not just in nations and regions, but corporates too, who are leaning in. They're looking for low carbon supply chains today, such as cement, concrete, steel, pulp and paper, chemicals and fuels. And CCS can help in many of these sectors, but we're also aiming to invest in efforts that take carbon capture and storage out of its silos. And concrete is a great example, a product that includes carbon intensive cement, water, and an aggregate like sand and gravel. And you can produce low carbon cement through CCS, and you can produce a synthetic aggregate or a carbonate rock to replace the sand and gravel by reacting CO2 with an alkaline feedstock. And if the CO2 is sourced from air, the concrete could even represent carbon removal. There's a cost associated with making these products, but there's also an increased value in the products that you're making just by their nature of being lower in carbon, and sometimes even carbon negative compared to their carbon intense analogs. In addition to storing CO2 in products like concrete, we're also excited about expanding our geologic storage program. We have 5 carbon safe projects all across the US today. They're all at phase 3. Phase 4 would mean that we drill a well and we inject CO2 deep underground. And these projects are all underway, but we need more. And we need to make sure that we have projects in regions where our efforts can be leveraged and CCS accelerated. For instance, states having or in the process of gaining Class 6 well primacy, in addition to regions where there's early activity in generating CO2 hubs. So we're focusing efforts on CCS, but we're also focusing on carbon dioxide removal for the hard to decarbonize sectors. And we want to be really thoughtful about this calculation of how much CDR we're going to need in order to reach net zero carbon emissions goals. And so when you look at deep decarbonization, especially in some of the industrial sectors, you recognize that in order to achieve it, we need things like water, we need things like land, we also need low carbon energy. And so we need to be able to prioritize these resources for deep decarbonization, but we're also going to need to prioritize some of these resources for carbon dioxide removal. And both are going to be needed to achieve net zero. In terms of carbon dioxide removal, we really want to focus efforts on hard to avoid sectors, not sectors where we have technologies today to simply decarbonize fossil. CDR could be coupled to things that we are hard to decarbonize, like the agricultural sector, aviation, and some of the transportation sectors. And so this is where we're excited about focusing efforts. And finally, when using fossil fuels and pursuing carbon management strategies, we also must be vigilant in examining their impacts on communities. And the Biden-Harris administration is committed to making central to all federal climate action, addressing the disproportionate health, environmental, economic, and climate impacts on disadvantaged communities. And as we're making investments in our office, we want to make sure that the investments are leading to benefits to communities and addressing frontline community concerns. So that's an overview of what we're doing in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management to advance the administration's commitment to meet the climate emergency and put in place a sustainable and fair net zero carbon economy. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. While we've got you here for just another moment, might I ask if you would speak just a bit more about the specific programs and ideas that you have around CO2 recycling as part of your programmatic work?
Sure. So looking at CO2 as a feedstock for products is something we're really excited about. I mentioned CO2 as a synthetic aggregate, as a component for low carbon concrete, but we're also interested in using CO2 coupled to clean hydrogen to produce chemicals and fuels as well. And the question is where do we get that clean hydrogen? And so a lot of the efforts that we're focusing on is looking at feedstocks like natural gas or sustainably sourced, regionally sourced biomass, gasification processes or conventional steam methane reforming coupled to carbon capture to produce hydrogen as a clean feedstock to react with CO2. Whether the CO2 is removed from the atmosphere or whether it's from a point source, combining them to create synthetic chemicals and fuels is something that we're also really excited about. But one thing I'll also mention is the synthetic aggregates is to distinguish between the two. In that form, the carbon can be stored durably on a long period of time, where in the case of fuels, we recognize that we're going to combust and re-emit the CO2 in the atmosphere. So at best neutral, provided if all the energy resources going in are neutral. And so one added benefit of the mineralization, it also scales on gigatons, is that the CO2 is permanently stored in the product on a long period of time, which is also of interest.
Marvelous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Without further ado, I would like to take a moment and introduce some of the other people who will be speaking with us today. One of those, I'm pleased to say, is Dr. Marcus Extevor of the Carbon X Prize. Marcus has been a leader in this field for many, many years and helped put together the Carbon X Prize, which successfully completed its run just recently in announcing its winners. He is an unquestionable leader in the field, and we're delighted to have him here moderating our panel. As part of that discussion, we have with us Dr. Colin McCormick, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and among other things, former senior technical advisor for the Department of Energy during the Obama administration. We're very pleased as well to have Dr. Stephanie Ntopi-Karas. Dr. Karas is the carbon technology strategist at Carbon Direct. She uses her expertise there on carbon capture, utilization, and removal to make investment decisions and provide strategic advisors. She has a PhD in chemical engineering from Stanford University. Like Dr. McCormick, Alex Zapantis is a recovering physicist. After he got his degree in physics, he pursued an MBA. After working in government and university, he is now at the Global CCS Institute and provides their thought leadership and manages much of their programmatic work. Today, the presentation that you're going to hear is a product of the work done by myself, Dr. McCormick, but first and foremost, Dr. Amar Bhardwaj. I'm sorry, Mr. Amar Bhardwaj. Amar was at Columbia University, where he worked here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and is the primary author of our report. Without further ado, allow me to turn it back to Amar to give the presentation. Amar, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Julio. And I wish I was a doctor, but I think I'll have to wait a couple years for that. But thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Dr. Wilcox, for your really insightful framing and overview. So my name is Amar Bhardwaj, like Julio mentioned, and I'm a researcher at the Center on Global Energy Policy and the lead author of this report that we're going to be presenting today. It's exciting to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking CO2 recycling. So the motivation behind looking into CO2 recycling is that the world relies on many products that are carbon intensive to produce, but don't really have viable alternatives right now. So these are products like aviation fuels, concrete, plastics, and others like Dr. Wilcox was mentioning. And 30% of global CO2 emissions are in hard-to-abate sectors that depend on these carbon-intensive products. So there's a real opportunity and a need for better solutions for these sources of emissions. And CO2 recycling could potentially provide some of these solutions by converting CO2 into valuable products. So a CO2 recycling process is a chemical process where CO2 is input into this pathway along with other chemical feedstocks like water or hydrogen and some form of energy to drive the reaction, either electricity in the case of an electrochemical process or heat in the case of a thermochemical process. And all these inputs go into a CO2 recycling pathway, and they're converted into fuels, chemicals, and materials that are used in these hard-to-abate sectors today. And because CO2 recycling consumes CO2 to produce a product instead of generating it, it has the potential to reduce emissions of the production of that product and create a lower carbon version of it. And since the products that are produced by CO2 recycling, like aviation fuels and these other ones, have economic value in existing markets today, it's a convenient idea to replace the conventional products with CO2 recycling products in those well-established markets. But despite the promise of CO2 recycling, it's still difficult to deploy and costly. So we need policy support that's properly informed by an understanding of the technologies and where they're at today. So that's exactly what we sought to do in this report. We modeled 19 CO2 recycling pathways to look at a better understanding of the current state of CO2 recycling and also the opportunities and the challenges to reach a global scale for these pathways. So that involved building out models for each of these pathways and evaluating some key characteristics of the techno-economics and other aspects of these pathways to get an idea for the state of them and where policy needs to go in the future. So there are 5 main sections to this analysis. The first is an estimated cost of production, or ECOP, and the sensitivities of those costs. A second is the carbon abatement potential for these pathways at global scale. A third is the effective carbon price and how that influences the economics. A fourth is the critical infrastructure needs that are needed to support these pathways at scale and provide the inputs they need. And fifth is, based on these findings and analysis, some policy recommendations that we're making to move forward. So I mentioned we looked at 19 pathways. 8 of those were electrochemical CO2 recycling pathways. So the first of those was water electrolysis to make hydrogen, which isn't strictly CO2 recycling, but we included it because the hydrogen produced by that pathway is important as an input for other CO2 recycling. The rest of the electrochemical pathways were electrochemical CO2 reduction pathways, where CO2 and water are electrolyzed using electricity run through them to create a variety of carbon-based products that we're seeing on the left here. And the reaction can be tailored towards any of these products in higher quantities as needed. We also looked at 11 thermochemical pathways, which also make a similar array of different products like olefins, which are used to make plastics and other products, methane, methanol, ethanol, syngas, jet fuel, urea, and concretes. So some of the processes we use to make those are CO2 hydrogenation, where you combine CO2 and hydrogen to make hydrocarbon products, Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, which combines hydrogen with carbon monoxide, CO, to make similar products. And for the concrete products, we're looking at concrete carbonation curing, where CO2 is incorporated into the cement within the concrete to improve its strength. So some important pieces of how we designed this study. We designed the pathways to consume low carbon inputs. So that means renewable power, chemical feedstocks that are generated electrochemically with renewable power to make sure that the inputs to this process have minimal emissions and we can abate as much emissions as possible by doing CO2 recycling. And we also assume these pathways could be scaled up to supply current global demand for their product to get a look at what these pathways would look like at scale. And we're in a similar vein looking at globally representative cost estimates. So not lowest cost first entry configurations where all the different conditions are optimized, but at a global scale across contexts, what might a representative cost be for these pathways? And lastly, we define market parity as when the cost of a production equals a selling price for a product. And some numerical assumptions before going into results. We assume that the renewable electricity price we're using is 9.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which might be high if you consider comparing it to, say, a solar PPA price. But importantly, this higher price incorporates non-generation costs and a globally representative scope. So transmission and distribution costs might be needed to deliver the electricity, taxes and levies on the electricity that all add up to a slightly higher price. And we're assuming a green hydrogen feedstock price of $6.3 per kilogram of hydrogen, which is a direct result from our other assumptions that we modeled out, and a CO2 feedstock price of $50 per ton of CO2, which corresponds to point source carbon capture as the source of that CO2. But we could also use different sources of CO2 like direct air capture, which will have different costs, and we look at the sensitivities to that as well. And we're assuming an electrolyzer capital cost of $1,000 a kilowatt. And all these prices could fall significantly over time, and lower costs are definitely available today in different limited contexts. But again, we're looking at a global representative perspective today. So the first set of results is on the estimated cost of production, or ECOP. And this chart here is showing the electrochemical pathways lined up along the bottom and pairs of bars. So the left bar in each pair is the breakdown of the cost of production, and the yellow bar on the right is the product selling price. So we can see that most of these pathways are far more costly than the product selling price today, so not very economic, and that the electricity cost is the largest portion of the overall ECOP. So electricity will be the main focus for bringing down costs, is minimizing that blue bar of electricity costs. But at the same time, the other components of costs, like the capital costs or the operation and maintenance costs that you see in the smaller components toward the bottom, those are also adding up to similar to or greater than the product selling price. So it'll be crucially important to bring those down as well to get to market parity. Another way to look at that information is to look at the ratio of ECOP to the product selling price for each pathway to see how far off they are from market parity. So we can see from this, the yellow line demonstrating market parity at a ratio of 1, carbon monoxide from electrochemical CO2 reduction is the only electrochemical pathway that's at market parity today. Hydrogen from electrolysis is a little more expensive, but not too much. And then 4 other pathways are at a ratio of around 5 to 7. And then methane and ethane are much more costly. So we can start to see that we can classify these pathways and where they're at as they progress towards commercialization based on this ratio, the cost ratio. So now looking at the thermochemical pathways, the costs are slightly lower, but still much higher than the product selling price. And green hydrogen feedstock cost, this green bar component, is the largest piece of ECOP. And also carbon monoxide is also a big component for the two pathways that use Fischer-Tropsch, which uses CO as a feedstock. But similar to the electrochemical pathways, the other components of cost, the non-hydrogen costs, are also on the order of comparable to the selling price. So those need to come down as well. And looking at the ratio of ECOP to selling price for the thermochemical pathways, we can see that there are three pathways that are at market parity today. That's ethanol from lignocellulosic biomass, precast concrete, and all concretes, these are concrete pathways. And then a good number of these other pathways have ratios of around 5 to 7, and methane, again, is much more costly. So looking at the sensitivities, we wanted to see what the main cost drivers were for these pathways, what could change the cost the most for bringing down costs. So we did a sensitivity analysis where we changed each input to these models up and down 20% one by one, and saw how much that changed the final ECOP price. So this is a sample chart here showing the inputs on the left, and the size of the bar demonstrates how sensitive ECOP is to that. So looking at the electrochemical pathways, that's where we see the sensitivity bars stacked up on the right here. And the main takeaway is that the key cost drivers are the selectivity of the catalyst, its ability to avoid unwanted side reactions, and the electrical energy efficiency of the catalyst. Also, the electricity price is a main driver. So these three all, in one way or another, bring down the electricity cost, which was a main component. And the catalyst performance in the top two bullets helps reduce the amount of electricity needed to produce a ton of product, and therefore brings down cost. The weaker cost drivers were capacity factor, electrolyzer capital cost, and CO2 feedstock price. So the first two of those tie into the capital cost component of ECOP, which isn't a huge component right now. And the CO2 feedstock price is interesting to look at because, as I mentioned, you can think of using different sources of CO2 as the input to CO2 recycling. And we can have some more flexibility in choosing which source we use, since the CO2 feedstock price isn't a big cost driver. So we can consider using direct air capture as a source, even though that's more expensive right now. So if we imagine using a $250 per ton source from direct air capture, which is 5 times the cost we're assuming for point source capture, that would only increase the cost of ethylene from electrochemical CO2 reduction by 19%. So there is some leeway in choosing that source. The thermochemical pathways show a similar story, where the key cost drivers are the selectivity, the electricity price, and the hydrogen price. And the weaker cost drivers are capacity factor, capital cost, and CO2 feedstock price again. Next, we'll look at the carbon abatement potential for these pathways at global scale. So this is defined as the emissions reduction of displacing a conventional production pathway for a certain product with CO2 recycling. And we're assuming this is at the scale of the current global demand for these products. And we find that the pathways have a combined carbon abatement potential of 6.8 gigatons of CO2 per year, excluding the more expensive methane and ethane pathways. But importantly, that's contingent on using low carbon inputs and electricity and feedstocks to create these CO2 recycling products, because it's very easy if we're using conventional, more carbon intensive inputs for CO2 recycling to actually emit more emissions than the conventional pathway it's trying to displace. So that's an important contingent and caveat there. Now, looking at the effects of an effective carbon price, with a certain carbon price, each pathway will reach market parity with its conventional product that it's competing with. And so this chart shows along the horizontal axis here an increasing effective carbon price, and the cumulative carbon abatement potential that's achievable with the pathways that are at market parity at that certain price. So at no carbon price, so $0 a ton, we see 1.6 gigatons CO2 per year of abatement potential, which comes mostly from electrochemical CO production. And then starting at $350 a ton of CO2 up to $425, there's a ratcheting up of cumulative abatement potential up to around 8 gigatons a year. And then some pathways that are much more expensive on a carbon price basis. And this $400 a ton range we see in the middle is definitely high in terms of what's on the table now for carbon prices or effective carbon prices. But all of these pathways in that region have a cost ratio of less than 6. So we can see that bringing the cost down will help move those dots over to the left and bring them into the territory of more reasonable effective carbon prices. Now, looking at the critical infrastructure needs, all these pathways consume huge amounts of resources and inputs to produce their products, and we need critical infrastructure to generate and deliver those inputs to those pathways. So looking at the resource consumption, pathways consume a combined 36,700 terawatt hours a year of low carbon electricity at global scale. That's a huge number. That's larger than the current global electricity consumption of 26,000 terawatt hours a year. And that has to be low carbon electricity. Most thermochemical pathways consume 80 million tons of hydrogen per year each, and that has to be low carbon hydrogen as well, compared to for the IEA's new net zero scenario, they have 140 million tons of hydrogen production from low carbon sources in 2030. And the pathways also consume a combined 5.3 gigatons of CO2 per year as feedstock CO2, compared to currently 0.2 gigatons used in CO2 recycling today. So all of this needs to be transported using and produced using critical infrastructure. So that adds up to trillions of dollars of capital investment in infrastructure that would be needed to reach global scale for these pathways. And you can see that each of these bars here shows a breakdown with a couple trillion each for each pathway. And the majority of that comes from renewable electricity generation, so solar or wind farm build out. Another big portion comes from the electrolyzers needed either to produce the feedstocks like hydrogen or to do electrochemical CO2 reduction. And a comparatively smaller amount comes from CO2 transport pipelines and electricity transmission infrastructure. So to summarize the key findings before going into policy recommendations, the costs of CO2 recycling are high and they're dominated by input costs. And we can classify these pathways and start to think about targeted policies using the ratio of ECOP to selling price. The main cost drivers for bringing down costs are catalyst performance and the prices of inputs. And the pathways have a combined carbon abatement potential of 6.8 gigatons of CO2 per year. It would require a high effective carbon price today to reach market parity for many of these pathways, and trillions of dollars of critical infrastructure would be needed for each pathway. So now to look at some policy recommendations. First, we recommend ensuring that CO2 recycling pathways consume low carbon inputs, including low carbon power, hydrogen, syngas, or ammonia feedstocks, because this will be crucial to making sure we achieve that high abatement potential that is available from CO2 recycling. We can also think about using different sources of CO2, as I mentioned, like direct air capture or biogenic CO2. And we can also prioritize these pathways strategically and use tailored policies based on the cost ratio. So on the left, we have a class of pathways that are at market parity today and need policies for market scale, for just scaling up to mass deployment. On the top right, there are pathways that are starting to enter markets. They have a ratio of less than 5, and that includes green hydrogen, CO2 hydrogenation, and urea production. So those could be targeted for early market demand pull measures. And for further technological innovation, we recommend all the previously mentioned pathways in addition to those with a ratio of less than 8. So that also includes electrochemical CO2 reduction, Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and syngas production, all to bring down these costs more. And the methane and ethane pathways have much higher cost ratios of over 25. So compared to these other ones, if we want to promote CO2 recycling, we recommend deprioritizing those to direct resources toward the more promising ones. So for the pathways that we want to innovate on, we recommend an RD&D agenda focused on catalyst innovation specifically to bring down costs, because improving the efficiency of the catalyst and the selectivity brings down the electricity and feedstock consumption of the process, so that brings down the cost, but it also alleviates the demand on critical infrastructure because we need less of it to generate and deliver these feedstocks to these pathways. So we can see catalyst performance as an efficiency lever, even though it's not always seen that way, because it does bring down the amount of resources we need and the supporting infrastructure we need to provide it. We also recommend creating demand pull for early market CO2 recycling products. So these can help create early markets and help incubate these more nascent technologies as they start to commercialize. So those include policies like public procurement standards, financial incentives, milestone payments, or prize competitions that help at each stage of the early growth of the pathways. And we recommend promoting build out of the critical infrastructure for these pathways. Like I mentioned, the low carbon electricity, transmission, electrolyzers, and CO2 transport infrastructure to provide the inputs needed at scale for these pathways. And that needs to start today so that when these pathways start to reach cost effectiveness, they're ready to scale. And lastly, the American Jobs Plan is, of course, a big topic right now. And although we're waiting for details on the most recent iterations of it, the initial plan had $35 billion in climate innovation and public procurement of cleaner cement. And our findings can, first of all, say that that's a good idea, that these policies can help unlock the emissions abatement potential of CO2 recycling, but also can provide granularity for how to actually enact these different policies and get the details ironed out. So we can provide guidance for an innovation agenda for CO2 recycling pathways, or define public procurement standards, and so forth. Now, one thing that we'd recommend adding to the American Jobs Plan, the initial plan had $15 billion in climate demonstration funding, which didn't include CO2 recycling pathways. But we'd recommend the following pathways that are starting to enter markets that would really benefit from early demonstration funding from the government. So that's electrochemical CO production, CO2 hydrogenation, and urea production. And the benefits that we accrue from these demonstrations could then have spillover effects for other more costly, less further along CO2 recycling pathways to help bring those towards commercialization as well. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion we're going to have with our amazing panelists today.
Thank you so much, Amr. That was terrific. Before I turn to Dr. Extevor, a number of questions came in asking about links to the report. If you go into the chat function of this event, you should find the link, which was shared to all the attendees. You can also, of course, go to our website. We also received questions about Amr's presentation that will also be made available when this event is put on our YouTube channel and shared broadly. You can go to our website and get both the link to the YouTube channel and the presentation there and then. Without further ado, I do want to turn to Marcus Extevor. He is the Executive Director of Prize Operations for Energy and Resource at the X Prize Foundation. Also just an excellent speaker and a good friend. Marcus, thank you so much for doing this. Over to you.
Thank you, Julio. Really pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone who's on the line with us. First, let me say congrats to Amr and yourself and Colin, just getting up to speed on the report. I think it's going to be a really powerful contribution to this field. And look, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to ask our panel to join in just a moment. First, I'll just take the moderator's privilege and just reflect on what I heard from Amr and what I read in the report as well. Just a couple of things struck me. I've been working in this space for some time, and I have noticed over the last few years that we have worked to move from a place where people think about this as a concept, CO2 recycling as a concept, which, let's face it, has been well understood by our friends in the chemistry world for some decades. But for the rest of us coming up to it, you know, the idea that we could recycle CO2 into products and that maybe this could be a way to abate CO2 emissions and maybe even be economically productive. Moving from the idea of this thing into more sharp questions about the practical implementation. Not could we do it, but how and when and in what specific context. And I think in that light, this report is a really welcome contribution. There have been a couple of attempts to try to quantify abatement potential, economic estimates by pathway. This report, I think, is by far the most comprehensive and deep, and it comes at a great moment. So I just want to recognize that I think it's a great contribution, but also that it's helping us get from a general discussion of the idea of CO2 recycling and into specific implementations. The second comment that struck me as I read through it is one of my pet theories has been, pretty soon, or maybe now, we will have to take the CO2 recycling world and actually diversify it into different parts. CO2 recycling is a common concept and it's a helpful framework and it's something that unites every one of these pathways, but the technologies, the business pathways, the logistics, the customers, the supply chains can be dramatically different if we're talking about CO or carbonated concrete or an electrochemical process that produces a liquid chemical. I think people in those industries will be familiar with that. And I think that's something I saw in Amr's remarks and you see reflected in the report as well. the pathway really matters, the costs can be different, and the way you actually execute this in the real world can be different. What that means is, if you're coming from the concrete or cement industry, the type of questions you have are quite different than if you're, let's say, an airline interested in low carbon jet fuels, or if you're a hydrogen producer interested in becoming part of this business. So I was encouraged to see the pathways really treated individually, but also distinguished and contrasted against one another. Okay, so without further ado, I'd love to invite our panels to turn on their cameras. Stephanie is with us, Colin is with us, Alex is with us. We may get Jen Wilcox in, but not at this moment. But I'm thrilled to be with the panel today. Hello, everybody, welcome. What I'm gonna do first is ask you to each very briefly introduce yourselves. You've already been introduced, but introduce yourself very briefly and give us one thing that stood out to you as you listened to Amer and as you heard and read through the report. Let me start with Colin, then I'll go to Stephanie, and then to Alex.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Colin McCormick, Georgetown University, co-author of the report. So perhaps it's not entirely new or fresh to me from Amer's presentation. I do want to reemphasize what Amer noted, which is the cost inputs we used here were framed at global scale. There are absolutely opportunities where you will find lower costs. Of course, other bad opportunities where you find higher costs. So we are not trying to say that these pathways are always going to be at these costs, or there are no ways at a smaller scale to approach these pathways at lower costs. What we're trying to do here is get a sense of global scale and not take any sort of free passes for kind of perfect alignment of cost. So I'm sure we'll revisit that topic, but I wanted to highlight that point that I think Amer emphasized.
Thanks, Colin. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Marcus. My name is Stephanie Karras. I'm a carbon technology strategist at Carbon Direct, where I work between both our advisory and investment businesses. The focus of my PhD research at Stanford was CO2 recycling and specifically electrochemical CO2 reduction. So needless to say, this is a pathway that is near and dear to my heart. I think two things that really stood out in the remarks today were, I think both that the feedstock CO2 price has really not as large of an impact on the selling price as you might expect. That's pretty encouraging for helping to develop markets for things like direct air capture. And also, I really just appreciate how it highlighted the need for the infrastructure development. I think that's a core part to developing carbon capture, use, storage, removal, the whole carbon management ecosystem.
Thanks, Stephanie. Over to you, Alex.
Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Apandas. I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Really is an excellent report. I read it yesterday. I guess one of the things that stood out to me is the enormous demand for zero emissions power that's required, so 37,000 terawatt hours. So it raises the question in my mind of what's the abatement that will be delivered if you use that renewable power to just displace all fossil generation in the current electricity system. Interesting question. I'll leave it for later discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so there's one thing I want to zero in on, and I was a little surprised, but then kind of encouraged to see hydrogen production, especially green hydrogen, included in the report. I was working on a talk for something else, and my one science talk says CO2 plus H2. The idea being like, if you're going to get off fossil hydrocarbons, you got to get the hydrogen from somewhere. That's not often discussed or put at the forefront in our sector. I'm just curious if any of the panelists have thoughts on that. Do you think that's true? And a related question is, do you think the hydrogen people are thinking about CO2 conversion in the same way? Feel free to speculate there if you don't work in that world, but just curious how you see that marriage between the CO2 recycling conversation and hydrogen, green hydrogen specifically. Let me throw to Colin first.
Well, yeah, I'll say yes. I think you become painfully aware of how important hydrogen is in this conversation. As you mentioned earlier, Marcus, we've sort of moved from the idea of CO2 recycling as an idea to the practicalities of it. And when you really start looking at the practicalities, you realize it's not the CO2, it's the hydrogen and the electricity. And that's a little bit inconvenient in some ways, since we've focused a lot of attention and thinking and research on driving down the cost of CO2 separation. And that's great, we should continue to do that. But we need to realize that there's giant other cost drivers that need just as more prioritization. I won't speculate on what the hydrogen folks are doing, but maybe others have thoughts on that.
Alex or Stephanie, do you want to comment on that?
Not so much on speculating, but oh, sorry, Alex, you can go.
Finish your comment. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Sure, I was going to say not so much on speculating what the hydrogen world's thinking about, but just really re-emphasizing just the critical importance that has to the full life cycle emissions. Really, for every CO2 recycling pathway, you have to consider the full life cycle from the source to, like Dr. Jennifer Wilcox mentioned earlier, really what is the product lifetime? What's that duration you're going to have of storage? That's really important for kind of how you do the carbon accounting towards any net zero or net negative goal, but really, especially in between everything there, the energy use, the carbon intensity for electricity, heat, and then especially the feedstock hydrogen. Really, for any hydrocarbon product you want to make with CO2, you're going to need that hydrogen feedstock. And like Colin said, that's a huge cost for all of these pathways. Sorry, Alex, off to you.
That's okay. Yeah, the comment I was going to make is that, of course, the report assumes 100% green hydrogen, but blue hydrogen is an option here as well. So if a proportion of that hydrogen was provided through steam methane reformation with CCS, for example, that would do two things. That would bring down significantly the cost of your hydrogen feedstock, because at least currently, and in most places around the world for some time, blue hydrogen is probably half the price or less of green hydrogen. But also it would very significantly reduce the demand for renewable electricity that would otherwise be required to produce green hydrogen through electrolysis, which would deliver another cost benefit and allow that green electricity to be used in grids, for example, to displace higher emissions unabated fossil fuels. So I think in the way this will actually play out is there'll be a mixture of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, with each option, each color of hydrogen, if I can put it that way, being deployed where it makes the most sense.
And Marcus, if I could just add one other point there, especially in thinking about blue hydrogen, you can imagine scenarios where there's the unique synergy with having on-site hydrogen production and CO2 capture, and using those both in a CO2 recycling process on site. And so I agree with Alex in that I think both blue and green hydrogen will be important for this conversation.
Okay, thanks for that. This is just a quick note to the audience. Please, if you got questions, bring them in the Q&A box. I see some great ones there. We're going to get to as many questions as we can in the next couple of minutes. So just a reminder, please bring them. And as I said, we're keeping an eye on that, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Don't be shy. Another question I'd love to raise, something else that really kind of floored me, and I'm glad, I want to dig into it a bit more. Amar mentioned that, first of all, I love ECOP. I saw that it appears in the report, I don't know, like 120 times. So I love the focus there. The CO2 feedstock price was not a major driver of ECOP for many of these pathways. I kind of couldn't believe that because we're used to talking about unreasonably expensive CO2 feedstock prices, because I think we tend to associate it with carbon capture, which is not, a ridiculous thing to assume. So I just have to dig into that a little bit. Specifically, should we take from this the fact that many of these pathway prices are not as sensitive to the CO2 feedstock price? Is this an opening for our friends in the carbon removal community? Amar, you gave an example of a 20% sensitivity. I forget which pathway it was in your remarks, but do you think that's an opportunity, or do you think this is something that's sort of already baked into different projects as they're being developed? Curious what the panel thinks about that.
I'll point out just a couple of pieces on that. So one is, this is primarily point source captured CO2. So you're looking at lower costs, $50 a ton is the model number here. If you're going to go to air capture, you are 5x or more of that number. So whereas if you were to remodel these with air capture, I think you'd rearrange some of those sensitivities. So let's just put that on the right footing there. There's obviously been a lot of discussion of sort of air to fuels, air-based CO2 recycling. We really need to make sure we're distinguishing those two categories, and that might need some sort of repeating a couple of times. This is going to be from the cheaper end compared to air source removed CO2 that you can be thinking about.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that correction. Alex, Stephanie, any comments? Oh,
sorry to jump in, but
go ahead, Amar.
Yeah, I do think that this is an opportunity for the direct air capture carbon removal community to find a use for the CO2. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that these processes make a product that you can actually sell and you can make money off of this. It's something that has inherent value in markets today. So that takes CO2, which is important to take out of the atmosphere for emissions reduction reasons, but you can't directly use all the time for some inherent value. You can turn that into something that is marketable. And so I think that's an important thing. And because it's not a huge component of the ECOP, like you mentioned, that makes it all the more feasible to incorporate CO2 into these CO2 recycling products and use that as a way to valorize the CO2.
Yeah, I think there will be specific opportunities where this makes a lot of sense. So you might have a particular low-cost opportunity here, for example, cements, which currently have a negative. Sorry, the ECOP is actually less than the production through conventional methods. So you can imagine a situation where you've got a cement producer who wants to offer a lower carbon content cement, a negative emissions potentially carbon cement, feeding into a market where you have a client who's willing to pay a little bit more for that product in order to be able to deliver a cement product which is actually much lower emissions, potentially getting down towards zero or maybe even negative emissions if it's using direct air captured carbon dioxide. So I think there will be specific circumstances where specific players can come together and make that work in the relatively near term.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. I want to make one more comment. When we talk about these policies to draw those products that are already economic into the market, it might confuse people. Why, if they're already economic, why do we need policies? What, they're already good to go, right? They're already in the black. A lot of that has to do with these questions of understanding life cycle analysis, validating that and getting purchasers comfortable with those numbers, setting up methods so that a buyer can say, do I trust the number that this producer is telling me that this is negative carbon? Who can I talk to? Is there a third party who can validate that? All of those factors, which aren't necessarily economically driven or that cost delta, all of those factors really matter when we want to look at scaling this production and really making these supply chains work. So that's a piece of what we were talking about on the policy end for the pathways that were already in the black.
I've got a follow-up. Stephanie, did you want to comment on that one too?
I was going to add to what Colin just said in terms of the critical importance here for policy, given that all of these CO2 recycling pathways, the products essentially need to compete with much cheaper incumbent fossil fuel-based chemicals and fuels. And so in order to really help close that cost gap, incentives and mandates are going to be important, but especially, the power of procurement standards in helping to create that market and demand pull, and also to help establish product standards. What does it mean to be carbon neutral? What LCA components do you need to consider? I think these are all really important things that need to be standardized as this industry develops.
Okay, so let me pick up right there, because I think we all have in some way come across a lot of companies, other groups that are in a position to actually execute projects in this space or deploy projects, manufacture products, et cetera. I think, as I mentioned before, the report Amar presented on today is going to be a huge boon, but what do these companies need to sort of take the next step, in your opinion? I think you've given some of these answers. Amar's report has given a lot of the fundamental data that could allow project planning, but aside from what's just been mentioned in the last couple of minutes, are there other things that you have noticed in your own daily travels that companies are really missing or looking for in order to take the next step? Is it a particular policy support? Is it another information, access to a partner, just comfortability and trust, so to speak? Curious what your thoughts are on that. Maybe I'll throw to you first, Alex, and then we can go Stephanie, Colin.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and has many answers depending upon the industry and your place in the world. So, ultimately, I think that there's a very strong move in the private sector generally towards looking for opportunities for lower emissions products and services for obvious reasons. But they're trying to square the circle because, as this report very clearly shows, the cost of lower emissions products and services in general terms is generally higher than higher emissions conventional products and services. So they're looking for those niche opportunities, the first opportunities where they can be the one to exploit, you know, a synergy between businesses at a market that's willing to pay for those emissions abatement services, for that lower emissions product, where they have a specific advantage that they can then feed into. And we see those emerging all around the world. But at the moment, they tend to be at the relatively small scale. What we need is the policy support to broaden the scope where those opportunities actually make economic sense and bring that investment forward. So the comments previously by Stephanie, for example, around the importance of policy are absolutely spot on. I think where there is intent signaled by government, backed up by policy, and the right commercial actors with the vision to be able to act, I think those opportunities will see investment. But at the end of the day, they need to be profitable for those investors. Otherwise, the investment won't come. And that's the challenge across the whole climate space.
Yeah, well said. Stephanie or Colin, you want to comment further on that? I know you did already a little bit, but the floor is yours.
Sure, I guess briefly, definitely through both our advisory and investment businesses at Carbon Direct, we're seeing, well, first of all, it seems the net zero commitments increase on a daily basis, but along with that is really a critical need to understand what that means and how to accomplish it. And so for both carbon utilization and removal, I think it really coming back to the carbon accounting and being able to understand how this impacts your supply chain and operations is crucial. But really, I mean, recycling CO2 provides an enormous market opportunity as all of these industries and corporate actors are looking to more sustainable alternatives for their operations and supply chain. And so I think there's huge opportunity for CO2 recycling. I think the major limitation right now, to your question, Marcus, about what's one of the barriers is really just having these supply chains developed. And I think that kind of comes back to the critical importance of considering the full value chain for CO2 recycling. Really, who is your capture partner if you're a carbon tech developer, and how are you going to get that to your end markets, transportation, and either use or storage? Having partnerships across that full value chain can really help in developing these early market entry projects.
I think those are both excellent points from Alex and Stephanie. I'll just mention many of these products, basically all of them, do need to meet engineering standards, very specific standards that are established for the conventional products. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, these CO2-based products are still somewhat outside those engineering standards. So there's some work to be done on that. And then there's also work to be done with the CEO or the C-suite may want to do this, but there still are folks in the, in the management line who, need to be convinced that these products absolutely will work as advertised. And there are engineering reasons why you can't mess around with that. So there's also just sort of some education and convincing to be done throughout the company, perhaps.
Okay, great. Julio, do you want to add in this one too?
Based in part on some of the comments that we received and this discussion around the carbon footprints and the standards, I wanted to point out a couple of things very quickly. One of them is that we have looked, in fact, at hydrogen production from wastes. And in fact, if you combine biohydrogen production from wastes with carbon capture, you can get very, very deep abatement. And if we're really looking at this from a feedstock and carbon footprinting perspective, we look forward to talking about that more. We should have a report on that coming out within a few months. We've also done a lot of work on learning curves and costs and sensitivities around green hydrogen. That report we expect to have published within a few weeks. These questions that have come in are ones we've thought deeply about, and we just want you to know we're on the case.
Terrific, thanks for that. Right before we do get to some of the questions, I'd love to do a rapid fire, and I know we always say that, but I'm really going to ask it to be rapid. Julio framed us at the beginning with the circular carbon economy. I love that phrase, but what is that? Let me start with you, Alex. What is that, and what does that have to do with what we're talking about today?
I think the circular carbon economy is just a concept that really talks to the need for every option to be available and deployed where it is the best option. So, it builds on the 3 R's of the circular economy, which has been familiar for quite some time, and adds a 4th R, which is remove, which captures essentially CO2 capture from the atmosphere or from industrial point sources. So really, it's just a building upon a well-established concept, the circular economy, to make it really fit for purpose for emissions abatement. And the central tenet of the circular carbon economy is that every option is required, every option is necessary, every option has value, and that the addition of the fourth R just ensures that CO2 capture from the atmosphere or from other sources is included within that construct. It's an all of the above construct in essence.
Going once. Stephanie, go ahead.
I'd say quickly for how this applies to a circular economy is really just in changing the conversation about CO2 from a waste to a valuable feedstock, where instead of having to use fossil fuels and digging up more resources, it becomes circular by turning that waste into a sustainable carbon feedstock for so many of the products that our modern society really depends on. And as Julio mentioned, biomass and waste can also be in that circular carbon economy framework as well. And so it's really just reimagining how we think of waste and reducing, reusing, and recycling as appropriate.
Okay. I'm going to apologize, Colin. I don't want to know what you think about the circular carbon economy. Just kidding. But I'm going to throw the first audience question to you. We've got a couple minutes. I'd love to squeeze a few in. Alexander Kirk says, basically in 2019, global CO2 emissions were over 30 gigatons. This report says we can get to about 6.8 of abatement. That's around 5 times less than the annual total amount. What needs to be done to get it above 30 gigatons a year? Let me add on my own spin. Should we think about this as something that can be increased to that level, or is it going to be closer to the 6-7 gigaton that you're estimating? How should we think about that?
Good question. I mean, this is not a replacement for aggressive emissions abatement in other sectors. Let's not speak about recycling as sort of the panacea solution. I don't think anyone on the panel would present that. So, of course, there are many, many other approaches we need for a full spectrum climate response. But we do think this can be a big part of that. And because, as Amar emphasized, there's economic value here, this can be framed far more as a business transition with profit, as opposed to a purely policy-driven effort.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Fred. Hi, Fred. He is essentially saying, is there a difference between CO2 recycling and CO2 utilization, or is it just semantics? Alex, what do you think about that?
I think there is a difference, potentially. So CO2 recycling is taking CO2 and transforming it into another product, in effect, by definition. Whereas utilization can involve the use of CO2 in ways which doesn't transform the CO2. For example, the most familiar example of CO2 utilization is in enhanced oil recovery. So that's not CO2 recycling. So there actually is a difference.
Okay, terrific. I'm going to call it there. Stephanie, I apologize. I owe you one. I didn't get you an audience question. Let me just say congratulations again to Amar, Julio, Colin, everyone that supported the report. Thank you very much, Alex, Stephanie, Colin, everyone for really joining the session. Thank you for the audience for participating. As Julio mentioned, recording will be available. The report is online. You should all read it. As I said, I'm really studying it. I'm working on a presentation for next week, and thank you very much for writing this because I can use it quite a bit. Unless there are any other announcements, Julio, I think we're near the end. Anything else we need to add before we close?
Just thanks to you, my friend. We're delighted to have had everybody here and to have you moderating so expertly and so well, and to thank all the panelists again for their presence and their help, as well as Dr. Wilcox. She did have to jump off. As I said at the top, a full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event is Thursday, July 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That event is Energy and the S in ESG Investing. It's going to be a barn burner. We sincerely hope you come. For a full calendar of upcoming events, please visit the Center on Global Energy Policy online. And in fact, we have added that link to the chat box, so get it before we drop. We certainly hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. One more time, thanks to Amar, and thanks to everybody for being here.
You all.
Thank you.